Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining us this afternoon, wherever you are in this country, for our webinar. If you're listening to the live webinar today on September 19th, 2018, and would like to earn ASHA CEUs for this course, be sure to attend the entire 1-hour session. The handout and all the forms you need to complete to get CE credit were emailed to you in the reminder email. So look for that if you missed it somehow. It should be from Sherry Locken. Mail the participant form and the evaluation form to the address shown at the bottom of this slide, so you can see it here, to Darlene Davis here at Pearson. The forms must be postmarked no later than September 26, 2018 to be submitted. If there's more than one person at your location, please download the attendance sheet and have each person who wants CEUs sign the sheet and complete the ASHA participant form and the evaluation form. If you are the only person at your site, you do not need to download the attendance sheet. There are no CEUs offered for the recording of this session available on the Pearson website. So without further ado, it's now my pleasure to introduce our speaker, Dr. Anne-Marie Kimball, who will do our presentation today.
Good afternoon, and as Nancy said, thank you all very much for joining us. We're going to talk about the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 in the context of assessing vocabulary. One of the first things that I need to do, of course, is to make sure that you are aware that Pearson Clinical Assessment is the sponsor of this presentation and that I am employed by Pearson. I will reference several tests and tools that are published by Pearson. Success in school requires age-appropriate knowledge of words and concepts and the ability to use the knowledge for listening, reading, speaking, and writing. Unfortunately, not all children enter school with the word and concept knowledge that's foundational to learning. So today's presentation is going to focus on how clinicians can use the new PPVT-5 and EVT-3 to assess vocabulary size and determine the need for vocabulary instruction. So I'm going to list 3 reasons why it's important to assess receptive. I'm not going to. Actually, I am going to list these, but these are our learning objectives for today. To list 3 reasons why it's important to assess receptive and expressive vocabulary, describe 3 administrative and scoring rules for the PPVT-5 and the EVT-3, and explain the process for using results from the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 to generate an age-appropriate intervention plan. And here's our agenda. So we are going to go kind of in this order. I'm going to begin by talking about the importance of assessing receptive and expressive vocabulary, again, cover administration and scoring, and then talk about planning intervention based on assessment data. So we're going to begin with the importance of assessing vocabulary. Looking first at the relationship between vocabulary and comprehension. The strong relationship of vocabulary to reading comprehension has been recognized for many decades. Along with other skills and abilities like verbal reasoning and understanding of syntax, the understanding of word meanings is essential for extracting meaning from text. One of the ways in which people learn the meaning of new words is by encountering them in text and then inferring their meanings from context. So individuals expand their vocabularies by reading. However, people with limited vocabularies often struggle to achieve comprehension, and this frustration often leads them to avoid reading. The result can really be a negative cycle in which vocabulary growth is stunted, further undermining the development of reading ability. And so to avoid this outcome, it may be beneficial, often beneficial, to select strategies such as direct instruction in vocabulary and to choose reading assignments that are appropriate for the person's vocabulary level. So it would appear that vocabulary and reading comprehension have somewhat of a reciprocal relationship. That is, just as vocabulary determines how well an individual can read, reading experience also influences vocabulary development. Good readers read more and develop large vocabularies, and this in turn enhances their comprehension skills. Poor readers read less and consequently stagnate as far as vocabulary growth is concerned, falling further and further behind in reading skills compared to their peers. This is a phenomenon that was originally noted by Wahlberg and Tsai, and it has come to be known as the Matthew effect. Vocabulary knowledge may also contribute to reading success in other less obvious ways. For example, young children with large oral vocabularies may be better able to analyze the representations of sounds in those words. Moreover, vocabulary knowledge helps beginning readers map spoken words to words in print. So a child who has a word in his or her oral vocabulary can more easily sound out and say the same word in print. Unfortunately, not all students enter school with the vocabulary knowledge they need for early literacy. A study by Betty Hart and Todd Risley conducted in the 1990s concluded that the word gap is related to socioeconomic status. Hart and Risley found that parents with higher SES expose their children to a greater frequency of words as well as more complex and encouraging words. Parents of lower SES used fewer words and more frequently used prohibitions rather than encouragements. As researchers predicted, by age 3, children in professional families were exposed to 2 times more words than children in welfare families. That's a significant gap. In effect, vocabulary bridges the word-level processes of phonics and the cognitive processes of comprehension. For various reasons, then, the assessment and development of vocabulary are important for teaching reading, particularly to beginning readers, to individuals who are at risk for reading problems or are displaying such problems, and to students who are learning English. Vocabulary knowledge is a form of achievement. It represents the words and word meanings that the person has learned through interaction with the environment both in and out of school. Vocabulary has long been perceived as being related to cognitive ability. Since their invention a century ago, most broad-range intelligence batteries have included some type of vocabulary subtest. The Cattell-Horn-Carroll model of cognitive abilities, which is based on a synthesis of hundreds of research studies conducted over many decades, includes as one of its core abilities a dimension labeled crystallized intelligence. This dimension reflects language development, reading comprehension, and other mostly language-related skills, including vocabulary or lexical knowledge. Carroll concluded that although vocabulary is linked closely to the broader dimension of verbal ability measured through reading, it appears to be a separable dimension. Various hypotheses have been offered to account for this relationship between vocabulary and overall cognitive ability. Individuals with greater cognitive ability may be better able to infer the meanings of new words from context, but on the other hand, it may be that people with larger vocabularies are more likely to read widely, can learn more readily through verbal instruction in a wide range of domains, or have a larger store of verbal concepts to call on as tools of thinking. So whatever the reason for the relationship, it's really important to remember that vocabulary is acquired knowledge or achievement, and that despite its strong empirical relationship to cognitive abilities, it is conceptually distinct from them. So I want to give you some time here to type into the chat box the response to this question. Why is it important to assess receptive and expressive vocabulary? I'll give you a little bit of time. Just type some responses into the chat box that you see. Thinking of why it is important to assess receptive and expressive vocabulary, so it's critical for learning, so that researchers understand how to measure vocabulary in a way that makes sense, so results are user-friendly for practitioners, to determine if there's a gap, to determine the child's foundational skills. Good. Yeah, those are all reasons that it's important to assess receptive and expressive vocabulary. Good. I see lots of good answers coming in. Assessing prior knowledge, determine if a student has the vocabulary skills to use reading tools, etc. Assess knowledge. Okay. Here's some on the slide, some of which you have put in the box. To identify students at risk for reading difficulties, identify appropriate interventions, detect language impairments, measure semantic development among non-readers, identify vocabulary level of students who are learning English, and determine if examinees' production vocabulary is consistent with recognition vocabulary. Still see a lot of good responses coming in. Getting a baseline for data-driven instruction, assessing knowledge to help with comprehension. Yes. So let's move on and look at, given that we've talked about the importance, administration and scoring rules for PPVT-5 and EVT-3, where we will indeed do those very things. So The author of the Peabody Picture Vocabulary Test, or PPVT, is Douglas M. Dunn, Ph.D. He's the son of the original PPVT authors, Lloyd and Leota Dunn. First developed in 1959, the PPVT has undergone several revisions, and the most recent is the 5th edition, which will be published later this year. The author of the Expressive Vocabulary Test, also known as EVT, is Kathleen T. Williams, Ph.D. Pearson will publish the 3rd edition of the Expressive Vocabulary Test also later this year. When used together, the PPVT-5 and its companion, the EVT-3, will provide information on receptive and expressive vocabulary acquisition. The ability to compare development of receptive vocabulary and expressive vocabulary is especially useful for individuals with differences between recognition vocabulary and productive vocabulary. So looking at what's new in the upcoming publications of the PPVT and EVT, both the PPVT and the EVT will have new items for both Forms A and B in these updates. These will refine so that stimulus words and picture stimuli may be applied to differing cultures within the U.S. in the current day. So they're all updated items. Also, each has updated normative data. They each have new digitally created art. Each includes new item analyses, in addition to the item analyses of vocabulary by part of speech, home versus school vocabulary, and Tier 1, 2, and 3 words. The PPVT-5 and EVT-3 will offer item analysis of STEM words, so science, technology, engineering, and math words. These will all help provide that assessment to intervention connection. We've aligned the administration rules. Both PPVT-5 and EVT-3 have the same Basal, reversal, and discontinue rules. We're going to take a closer look at those in just a little bit, at the Basal, reversal, and discontinue rules, but they are now going to be aligned across the two tests. Both PPVT and EVT will have digital applications on Q Interactive and Q Global. These digital applications, of course, still maintain those basic qualities of the PPVT and EVT, such as the ease of administration and response capture, the brief administration time, and the accurate scoring. Q Interactive will provide individual and combined reports, and Q Global will provide the intervention information as a report option. I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. Things that are going to stay the same include that we will still have both Forms A and B for each test, with about 14% shared items. The age range for both tests remains from 2 years, 6 months to 90 years plus, and they will both provide that assessment to intervention connection. So what do these two tests measure? The PPVT-5 is a measure of receptive vocabulary for standard American English. The EVT-3 is a measure of expressive vocabulary and word retrieval for standard American English. Both are qualification level B products. As I mentioned, the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 will be available in paper pencil format and in digital formats. And the digital formats include digital scoring and reporting via the Q Global system, digital stimulus books and manuals via the Q Global system, and digital administration and scoring via the Q Interactive system. The digital completion time for each test on each system is about 10 to 15 minutes. So just a few more words about these digital options. The digital options are available on two digital systems, Q Global and Q Interactive. PPVT-5 and EVT-3 scoring is available on Q Global, a web-based digital platform that calculates all the scores and presents the test results in an easy-to-understand narrative report that can be downloaded to a word processing program and then incorporated into clinical reports. These Q Global score reports are a separate component from the PPVT-5 or EVT-3 kits. These reports can be purchased individually or as an unlimited subscription annually. Evidence-based interventions are also included as an optional selection in Q Global report creation, and these intervention suggestions align to the examinee's standard score and to his or her age where appropriate. And then in addition, digital versions, as I mentioned, of the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 manuals and STEM books are available on Q Global. And then the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 will also be available on Q Interactive, the digital platform that allows the administration and scoring of a test using the two digital tablets that work together through a Bluetooth connection. So the examiner uses one tablet to give instructions to the examinee, record and score responses, take notes, and control visual stimuli, and the examinee uses the other tablet to view and respond to test items. And the Q Interactive usage is also purchased separately. So looking at the PPVT-5 first, this is the format that has been used to present the items for the PPVT and that will be retained for the PPVT-5. So the clinician says the stimulus word and the examinee selects one of 4 pictures to respond. Each PPVT item consists of 2 parts, that STEM word and the array of the pictures. One of the pictures depicts the STEM word, and the other 3 are distractors that are appealing choices for examinees who are unsure of the correct answer. This format's been really successfully used in each of the previous PPVT editions. The selection of the stimulus words is based primarily on logical reasoning and lexical reference works, and the distractors are developed to elicit a similar number of responses. The 4 pictures on each stimulus page are balanced for color, size, and orientation. The PPVT-5 edition consists of 2 forms, as I mentioned, Form A and Form B, each with 240 items ordered by increasing difficulty, and the 2 forms were carefully balanced with respect to stimulus word characteristics, representation by sex and race ethnicity in the illustrations, as well as item difficulty. The item set for Form A corresponds to the item set for Form B by including approximately the same number of items for each part of speech, verb, noun, or attribute, and content category, and that spanned a nearly identical range of item difficulties. So the test administration follows a system of age-based start points and basal and ceiling rules that I'll tell you about in just a little bit. So you can see, I see a question in the chat box that I want to answer aloud really quickly. Someone is asking why drawings have been used over photos, and I just want to reiterate again that we're using digital art now because of scalability, and so drawings are not always as easily scaled, and digital art has been chosen since we have both the paper and pencil and the digital formats for PPVT-5 and EVT-3. And so here you can see that the directions, depending on what system you're using, you might be saying, put your finger on the stimulus word, or show me, or point to, or find, or if you have someone who has motoric difficulties, you might say, tell me the number for the particular STEM word. For the EVT-3, the examiner shows a picture to the examinee and asks something about the picture. And then the stimulus question for each item is listed on the record form. So, for example, you can see here that the question is, what is, and you would point to the flower. What is this? And point to the flower. So the start point rule, I mentioned that it's the same for both tests. The recommended age-based start points are shown in the record forms to help shorten testing time while ensuring that the majority of individuals experience success on the first items that they encounter. And so start points are noted at appropriate item numbers within the record form, and the start points are indicated on the tabs in the stimulus book. So if you were to anticipate, though, that an examinee might perform well below average for his or her age, instead of beginning at the indicated start point, you might wish to disregard that and begin test administration with item 1. Basal and ceiling rules, again, the same for each test, PPVT-5 and EVT-3. The basal rule for PPVT-5 and EVT-3 both is achieved when an individual responds correctly to the first 3 consecutive numbered items from the start point for his or her age level. If an individual does not achieve a basal for his or her age level, the examiner would administer the items preceding the start point in reverse order until a basal of 3 consecutive correct items is established, and then return to the first incorrect response and resume testing forward. The ceiling is achieved when the individual responds incorrectly to 6 consecutive items. When the individual earns 6 consecutive 0 scores, the items that follow are assumed to be beyond his or her ability, and administration of those items should be discontinued. So when an older individual, maybe older, when an individual doesn't achieve 6 consecutive scores of 0 before the end of the test, the last item is considered the ceiling. So you'll note at the bottom of the slide that the basal and ceiling rules for the PPVT-5, you'll note this on the slide, but you'll see at the bottom what the older rules were. The PPVT-4 included 12 item sets. The basal was achieved when the examinee had 11 or 12 correct responses within an item set, and the ceiling was achieved when the examinee had 8 or more incorrect responses within an item set. So the basal and ceiling rules for the EVT-3 are also changed from the 2. Like the EVT-3, the EVT-2 used a continuous item set, but for the EVT-2, the basal was achieved when the examinee had 5 consecutive correct responses, and the ceiling was achieved when the examinee had 5 consecutive incorrect responses. So again, the new basal rule will be for both tests 3 consecutive correct items from the start point, and the new ceiling rule is 6 consecutive incorrect responses. So here is an illustration of the recording and scoring procedures for establishing a basal. In this example, the examinee started with a correct response to item 10, but had to reverse because of an incorrect response to item 11. The examinee then responded correctly to items 9 and 8 in that order, and a basal of 3 consecutive correct items was established from items 8, 9, and 10. So testing then continued with item 12, and items were administered in forward sequence until the discontinue criterion or ceiling was met, 6 consecutive scores of 0, which here was 16. So the ceiling, I guess you can't see that. Sorry, it seems that the bottom banner may be across the page there. Right down here at the bottom is a 16 with a 0, and so that would be the ceiling item. Recording responses for the PPVT-5 during the administration, you will circle 1, 2, 3, or 4 in the record form to indicate the response that's been provided by the examinee to each administered item. And the correct response you can see is printed in bold color. Here it appears kind of a reddish color. And the incorrect responses are printed in black. If the individual doesn't respond or says, I don't know, the examiner would circle NR for no response in the score column. After the response to an item has been recorded, then the examiner would note that item's score by circling 1 for correct or 0 for incorrect in the score column. And I'm sorry, the score column is itself not pictured on this slide. Here you're seeing the response, the item response column instead. You'll see here, though, that there were 2 errors in the items which have the number in black circled here and here, instead of the correct number in red. So the raw score would be the ceiling item minus the number of errors. You have 2 errors, and depending on where your ceiling item was, you would indicate it on the front page of the record form. There's a space that looks similar to this for calculating the raw score and reporting the test results. And again, you would calculate the raw score by recording that number of the last item, that ceiling item, administered in the calculating the raw score table, and subtract the total number of 0 scores or the total errors from this item number, and that difference is the raw score. And then there are steps that are listed in the manual that would help you determine the standard score, the confidence interval, the percentile rank, the normal curve equivalent, stay9, test age equivalent, and gross scale value. Or, of course, you can use the scoring on Q Global to quickly and accurately derive that information, or if you're using Q Interactive, assessments administered on Q Interactive are automatically scored. For the EVT-3, when recording and scoring these responses, you'll circle the score that corresponds with the response, either correct or incorrect, and then you'll calculate the raw score the same way, ceiling item number minus the total number of incorrect items to get the raw score. Okay, another question for you. What is the basal rule for the PPVT-5? Oh, I'm seeing, yes. Okay, basal rule, 3 consecutive items from the start point, exactly. Okay, with which item do you start if you suspect the child has an intellectual disability? Again, just type your response here. Item 1, item 1, item 1, item 1, item 1. Okay, good. That's important. I just want to make sure that you understand that and that you heard me say it, because sometimes we hear that question. All right, so let's look at linking the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 results to interventions. starting with just the overall concept of thinking about how the quantitative results that the examinee's performance on these two assessments, PPVT-5 and EVT-3, can be interpreted both quantitatively and qualitatively. And the quantitative results can be used to determine if an individual has difficulties understanding and learning vocabulary. The qualitative results, in conjunction with other test results, can be used to determine if an individual has a language disorder and to derive the most useful and meaningful educational information and therapy programming recommendations. So it's useful for identifying those if there are needed interventions and what those might be. Looking first at the quantitative interpretation, there are norm-referenced standard scores available to compare an individual's performance to the performance of other individuals of the same age in the normative sample. And this score is on a normalized standard score scale that has a mean of 100 and a standard deviation of 15. The PPVT-5 and EVT-3 provide age-based percentile ranks for the standard scores, and percentile ranks indicate an individual's standing relative to others of the same age in the normative sample. They reflect the percentage of individuals from that normative sample that scored at or below a given score. And then the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 provide test age equivalents, and this is the test age equivalent of a total raw score indicates the age at which a given score is equal to the median performance. And then growth scale values, which some of you may be familiar with. These provide an objective score for measuring changes in PPVT-5 or EVT-3 performance over time. And so you can use growth scale values to track an individual's vocabulary knowledge to determine if the individual has gained additional vocabulary since a previous administration of the test, and to measure the efficacy of the intervention protocol that's been implemented for an individual. So both tests use the standard score descriptors, which can be found in the manuals and are used in the reports. You're probably familiar with these. Looking at the qualitative analyses, the qualitative analyses of the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 test results can supplement that quantitative information that was provided by the standard scores, and it really may assist you in developing hypotheses about an individual's test performance and vocabulary abilities. Just as an example, you may wish to consider how the individual performed on subsets of PPVT items, or how the individual performed on the PPVT-5 in comparison to the EVT-3. There are several procedures for conducting approaches to qualitative interpretation. They're described pretty thoroughly in the manual, but I'm going to go over some of them here. They include receptive versus expressive performance, so PPVT-5 and EVT-3 score differences, and crossover vocabulary sampling between the PPVT-5 and the EVT-3. And then item analysis, home versus school vocabulary, vocabulary by part of speech, three-tier model of vocabulary, and STEM vocabulary. Individuals are exposed to vocabulary from birth, but barring any physical impairments, they see and hear words in different environments such as home and community and school and later work. Through informal observation as well as overt teaching, children learn to attach names to people and animals and objects, and they also begin to understand that actions have labels just as objects do. And then attributes are also learned as part of the child's daily dialogue with others, like just hearing an instruction such as put on your yellow shirt contributes to a child's vocabulary knowledge of the attribute yellow as well as the object shirt. Individuals may demonstrate different vocabulary acquisition patterns depending on factors such as home communication or academic learning or language and learning disabilities. So item analysis can identify possible patterns in an individual's performance. And the four analyses I've mentioned and we'll talk more about in a bit, they divide the items into categories. Each analysis may offer helpful insights into the individual's vocabulary strengths and needs based on the subset of PPVT items that were administered and EVT items. So again, there are appendices in the manual that include some reproducible master worksheets and instructions on completing each analysis. These analyses can be completed in Q Global reporting when item level information is entered. Q Interactive scores each administration automatically, as I mentioned. Classification by part of speech was part of PPVT-4 and EVT-2. Classification by home and school and tiered words was part of EVT-2, and all three are part of PPVT-5 and EVT-3. Classification by STEM words is new to both PPVT-5 and EVT-3. So let's look at these. Let's start with receptive versus expressive performance. Performance on the PPVT-5 is dependent on vocabulary knowledge, but it doesn't require retrieval or expressive skills for responding. But in contrast, the EVT-3 instrument measures both vocabulary knowledge and word retrieval skills. So by comparing performances on the PPVT-5 and EVT-3, you can explore some hypotheses about the basis of vocabulary problems. And there's two means of comparing receptive versus expressive performance. These are PPVT-5 and EVT-3 score differences and crossover vocabulary sampling. The last page of the record form provides space for calculating these score differences. Instructions for completing the comparison and evaluating the statistical significance of any score difference are provided in the appendices as well. If there's no significant difference between the individual's PPVT-5 and EVT-3 scores, and if the scores are at a similar level, you can conclude that the individual's vocabulary knowledge is at that level. But if there's a significant difference between the scores, it's considered best practice to report both the statistical significance of the difference and its prevalence, because doing so prevents overinterpretation of a difference that's not statistically significant or that might be statistically significant but is fairly common in the population. So let's have you give me some of your hypotheses about a pattern of performance that indicates receptive scores are higher than expressive scores. I'm going to type a little bit into the chat box giving me some indication. Might indicate word retrieval difficulties. A lot of people are saying that. Yes, yes. Word finding difficulties, articulation difficulty, English language learner, delayed expressive language, okay, apraxia. So an individual's receptive vocabulary is typically larger than his or her expressive vocabulary. Individuals often can understand words that they choose not to use, or they don't have the occasion to use when they're speaking or writing, or they maybe have difficulty retrieving. And they also know a lot of words partially or incompletely. This is recognized as a natural point in the progression of acquiring full knowledge of a given word. A significantly higher receptive score, though, could indicate that the examinee is good at using partial knowledge of the meanings of words to rule out distractors or to pick correct responses. Or it could also suggest word finding or word retrieval difficulties, as many of you pointed out. Although semantic knowledge is required to accurately identify the correct picture on the PPVT-5 task, the EVT-3 task places higher demands on an individual's word finding and retrieval abilities because he or she now has to provide a one-word response within 10 seconds. So, to express yourself effectively, one has to be fluent as well as use the right word or words. Also, as an individual's reluctance to speak might explain why he or she performed better on a receptive task than on a task requiring expression. The testing environment or the individual attention of an unfamiliar examiner could make the examinee uncomfortable, especially in the case of a young child. Perhaps the individual resists making a best effort on a task that requires him or her to speak, no matter how skilled the examiner is at establishing rapport. So it's really important to consider the individual's demeanor during the testing process so that results aren't overinterpreted and inappropriate conclusions are avoided. And of course, there may be other factors contributing to a receptive vocabulary score that's higher than an expressive one. For example, if an individual has a broad experiential background, he or she may know various labels for the same object or action and may have a better chance of recognizing the single word that's used as a stimulus for the PPVT-5 item. A score on a receptive vocabulary instrument that's higher than the score on expressive also might indicate that the individual comes from a language-rich environment or that they're a fluid reader. So again, there's a lot of things that can contribute to that pattern of responses, and it's important to evaluate the particular examinee and situation to determine what might be contributing. Let's look at crossover vocabulary, which is another qualitative analysis of receptive expressive comparison. This involves evaluating performance on EVT-3 items whose correct responses appear as stimulus words on the PPVT-5 instrument, or that assess the same or similar semantic concepts represented in some PPVT-5 items. On the PPVT-5, a correct response might indicate that the individual recognizes the word and knows or partially knows its meaning. On the EVT-3, a correct response indicates that the individual knows the word or concept and can retrieve that word or similar semantically correct word. Looking at home versus school vocabulary, the words on the PPVT-5 and EVT-3 and the pictured context that they represent have been categorized as home or school in order to estimate the impact of home living versus educational experiences on the examinee's English vocabulary development. By using this kind of classification system to compare the child's performance, interesting hypotheses can be generated about the opportunities the child has had in his or her home and educational environments to build his or her English vocabulary, and about how much he or she is profiting from these two environments in terms of English language vocabulary development. If there are more correct responses using vocabulary common to home, this might indicate that the vocabulary building influences at home are enriched through things like frequent reading and conversation in English. Similarly, more correct responses common to the school setting might indicate that the child is profiting from English language educational experiences. And then the errors in either the home or the school vocabulary classifications might indicate that the student may need help in acquiring a broader English vocabulary. Looking at vocabulary by part of speech, each PPVT-5 and EVT-3 item is designated by its usage within the test, so as a noun or a verb or adjective or adverb, and then adjectives and adverbs are collectively labeled attributes. So the vocabulary by parts of speech item analysis categorizes each of the items as noun, verb, or attribute, and a comparison of error types by these parts of speech may indicate where vocabulary instruction should initially be focused for the greatest impact. Another type of item analysis, the three-tier model, is adapted from the work of Beck, McEwen, and Kuchen as described in their book, Bringing Words to Life. This informational resource on effective vocabulary development reports on the positive results of several studies based on their approach. In this model, words are classified into three tiers for determining where to focus vocabulary instruction for the greatest effect. So the first tier includes words that rarely require instructional attention and that most students are expected to know upon entering school. Tier 1 words are usually learned through home or community interactions. The second tier includes high-frequency words that are found in both oral and written discourse across a wide range of material, and these words are described as those that have a powerful impact on verbal functioning. And then the third tier contains lower-frequency words whose use is limited to specific content areas. So examinees with many Tier 1 errors may have a seriously limited vocabulary base on which to build and may need help in following instructions both inside and outside the school setting, or they may need help in acquiring a broader vocabulary. Examinees with many Tier 2 errors may need instruction with these types of words so as to more fully benefit from instructional settings. They may need specific help in identifying actions and attributes and in recognizing the purpose of these words in print, or they may have heard this vocabulary, but they may not have learned it fully. And then examinees with many Tier 3 errors may not have been frequently read to, if they're preschool age, or they may not have read widely, school age through adult. They may have limited background or world knowledge, or they may lack exposure to an enriched verbal environment as compared with their same age peers. And then the new item analysis on both PPVT and EVT is the STEM, the Science, Technology, Engineering, and Mathematics vocabulary analysis. Many educational institutions have placed great emphasis on science, technology, engineering, and mathematics curriculum, and the goal of this educational initiative is to provide students with high-quality STEM learning opportunities and experiences to better equip them as they later enter the workforce. The evaluation of STEM vocabulary is another type of qualitative analysis that can be applied to completed PPVT-5, EVT-3 forms. Word learning is an essential skill that provides students with the building blocks for future academic success. And for those students who receive STEM instruction, a reduced STEM vocabulary knowledge really may jeopardize their school or workforce readiness. Proficiency in the use of STEM vocabulary enables students to access the content that's being emphasized in their academic texts, and then develop high-level academic discourse in these areas. So the PPVT-5 EVT-3 items that pertain to STEM have been identified in order to estimate the impact of STEM vocabulary knowledge on students' academic progress. Individuals with above-average PPVT-5 or EVT-3 scores may demonstrate extensive knowledge of non-STEM and STEM vocabulary. For an individual who has demonstrated an expected level of receptive vocabulary knowledge as compared to others of the same age, you may find it helpful to know how extensive his or her STEM vocabulary knowledge is and how it's impacting their academic performance. When a student scores well below expected, of course, results may indicate that he or she has not acquired STEM vocabulary to the extent that his or her peers have, and in this case, you may want to learn more about the student's language experiences and opportunities in the school setting, and why the student doesn't seem to possess knowledge of the STEM vocabulary associated with these academic experiences. These kinds of results may aid in the development of accommodations and modifications to the student's STEM curriculum to allow academic content to be more accessible. That's a nice addition to PPVT-EVT-3. So based on the item analysis, Q Global scoring will suggest interventions. The report will also provide resources and references you can consult to get additional information. Some of the sample suggested interventions include these that you see here. I'm going to say a few things about them. The cooperative learning or peer tutoring this is a common instructional technique in which students work in pairs or small groups to teach one another. Some of the benefits of cooperative learning are that students can work independently while engaging in intellectual discussions, which together can result in improving student motivation and increased time on task. Cooperative learning also can be used as a tool for building children's expressive vocabulary skills. Robust vocabulary instruction is a term coined by Isabel Beck and her colleagues to describe an approach to vocabulary instruction in which words are brought to life for students. Beck and her colleagues argue that typical vocabulary instruction is dull and less than interesting, doing little to provoke children's independent interest in and motivation toward words. So with robust vocabulary instruction, students learn to be intrigued by and curious about words they don't know and to notice words in their environments whose meanings they don't know. Given that there's far too many words to teach directly to children through direct instruction, Beck and her colleagues have suggested that robust vocabulary instruction provides a critical avenue for making children seek out the learning of new words on their own, thus becoming independent learners of vocabulary. And then semantic mapping is one of the more well-known and often used vocabulary instruction activities. With semantic mapping, students are helped to develop a visual map of the lexical linkages among words. These maps can help students to learn the meanings of new words and to understand how groups of words are conceptually related. It's a multimodal activity that involves visual representations of words, and it may be particularly helpful for students who benefit from hands-on active learning activities. And then prefix instruction. When providing vocabulary instruction in the later elementary grades, instruction typically includes some direct instruction on prefixes. Most prefixes have a clear lexical meaning, like meaning not, and most are used in a great many words, so providing instruction in prefixes is considered a fairly efficient and effective approach for significantly broadening students' vocabulary. And then the Bridge of Vocabulary by Judy K. Montgomery offers an explicit set of vocabulary intervention activities that are tied to evidence-based research and to curriculum standards that were developed for both general and special educators. Each activity in the Bridge of Vocabulary 2 directly links a specific vocabulary intervention to a research-based strategy and a state-level curriculum standard and presents a systematic, intensive approach to help foster vocabulary and language growth. So, to sum a bit, using various methods of qualitative analysis to develop hypotheses about the examinee's performance is what when we talk about linking results to intervention, that is the way we like to think about it. The qualitative and then the the different methods of quantitative analysis help you understand where a person is, and then give you some beginning jump-off points for the hypotheses about what is causing the type of performance or what is affecting the examinee's performance. And so information gained then by one or more of these approaches can supplement that quantifiable information provided by those standard scores. So the process is looking at the quantitative analysis and then the qualitative information, which links you to the interventions. The quantitative, again, tells you where to look, vocabulary versus word retrieval. The qualitative helps you drill down to those interventions, the receptive versus expressive performance, the home versus school vocabulary analysis, the vocabulary by part of speech analysis, the three-tier model of vocabulary analysis, and the STEM vocabulary analyses. They all help identify what interventions will be helpful. So just to review the outcomes that we had today, or the objectives, we wanted to list the 3 reasons why it's important to assess receptive and expressive vocabulary, describe administration and scoring rules for the PPVT-5 and EVT-3, and explain the process for using PPVT-5 and EVT-3 results to generate an age-appropriate intervention plan. I want to call your attention to the next webinar that we're going to have in this particular series, that will cover what's entitled Beyond Vocabulary Scores, Interpreting Results from the PPVT-5 and EVT-3, that will take a deeper dive into the actual interpretation. It's going to be held on October 10th from 1 to 2 p.m. Eastern Time, so be sure to locate and register on the PPVT or the EVT page on PearsonClinical.com, and the very last page in your handout and on the slides, which I'll skip to really quickly, gives those 2 web pages and the web page for the Canadian website and my email address if you have any additional questions. At this point, I'm going to turn this back over to Nancy Castillejo to see what we have left. Nancy? Nancy, you're on mute.
Sure am. Sorry about that. This is just a reminder about what you need to submit for CEs, and I apologize to the NASP and APA people. I forgot to put that slide in there. So ASHA people, you have to mail your forms to Darlene Davis, postmarked no later than 9/26/2018. NASP and APA people have the choice of emailing the form to Darlene K. Davis at Pearson.com, or to mail your evaluation form to Darlene at the address on this form. Hopefully that wasn't confusing. ASHA people have more forms to complete than NASP or APA people who just need the evaluation form. If there are more than one person at your site, all of y'all need to submit the attendance form. Thanks for joining us today. We cannot be on the line longer to answer questions, so if you would like to send questions, do that in the chat box in the next minute or so, and we will work on getting answers back to you. Thanks for joining us today.